Dr. Duennebier. I did have French at one point, many years ago, but many. It might be called a doom and gloom man, but he is preceded by L. King Hubbard, I believe his name was, a geologist who wrote a book in 1970, called The End of Peak Oil, I think it was, and he projected, based on all the geological studies worldwide, that the production of oil would peak right about now as demand for oil was growing. So you have decreased supply, increased demand, all kinds of hell is going to break loose. And some people could say, no, we keep discovering more and more oil. Yes, but it isn't. That's because now we have the technology to go down 5,000 feet. And what happens when you go down 5,000 feet? Number one, you've got a hell of an expense associated with that. Number two, you've got a lot of risks. Witness the BP oil spill. Chevron is being sued by the Brazilian government for a spill off the Brazilian coast, and they're being sued by the Ecuadorian government for spills in the Ecuadorian Amazon basin. Yes, the oil's there, but it is more and more difficult. And of course that has a ripple. The price of oil, as we all know, has a ripple effect all the way up and down the economy. And on that very cheery note, I turn it over to the good doctor.
Thank you. Aloha, everybody. Thank you. This is, as you got the idea, this is not a fun talk, but hopefully it's about as close to the truth as I can come. But you can decide for yourselves whether you believe me or not. I strongly suggest that you look up some of the references. Just Google peak oil, Google collapse. There's all kinds of nasty things you can Google and come up with good references. This is a very short talk for me. I usually give about an hour talk, and trying to cover everything in an hour is very difficult. So I've really had to shorten things down for this talk. And the one thing I won't talk very much about is the future without cheap energy, just because the time is not there. I'll come back and talk about that if you like some other time. I will be stressing oil, mainly because I strongly believe that oil is the one resource that is critical at this point in time. One caveat, there's critical because we're reaching its peak, and it's going to start the downslope, and people want more and more all the time, and it is the transportation mainly, and it is the thing that we're going to miss the most as things go on. But it's very difficult to predict the future, and I've tried not to. Most of the talk will be based on what I consider to be facts, or at least the truth. Things are changing very fast on the Earth. It may not seem like it, but they really are. And if you go back to 1950, the United States was the world's foremost oil producer, foremost oil exporter, the largest exporter of machine tools, manufactured goods, and the foremost creditor nation. And we were essentially self-sufficient in just about everything. Today we're the foremost oil importer. We import more oil than anybody else. Foremost debtor nation. We owe more than anybody else, and it goes up, skyrockets, it seems, every year. The world's foremost importer of manufactured goods and non-petroleum resources. And the manufacturing jobs, at least in 2004 when this was done, were fleeing to other countries. Now they have flown. Is energy cheap? Why can I say energy is cheap? Cheap. Boy, gasoline is now $4 a gallon. Jeez, that's really expensive. Well, if you go back and look, one human being working hard, muscle power, so a laborer, for instance, can do about 1 kilowatt hour of work in a day. That's a rough number, but using muscle power, that's about what a person can develop or use. And for that work, you might pay a person $80, maybe $100 for a day's work. Well, 1 gallon of oil contains 40 kilowatt hours of energy, for which you pay less than 11 cents per kilowatt hour. So for the energy in that gasoline to be as expensive as human muscle power, gasoline would need to be about 800 times more expensive than it is now. Remember, 100 years ago, we didn't have gasoline, or very, very little of it. So everything that I'm going to talk about has pretty much happened in the last 100 to 200 years. Energy from fossil fuels is cheap, and it's still cheap. If you look back at the history of energy, every advance in technology that we've had that has given us a better source of energy was not because of the depletion of the previous resource, it's because the new one was cheaper or better in some way. So we started with human muscle power, went to animal power. Of course, we were still using human muscle power. We discovered fire. Then we discovered how to use wind for solar and for windmills. Water power, these are both forms of solar. And then we discovered fossil fuels and how to use fossil solar energy and oil and gas. And now we have nuclear fission. So these are all things that in some way or another are better than what we used before. In terms of coal, oil, and gas, they're also a tremendous amount cheaper than what we had before. But now we're starting to lose the oil, the gas, and the coal, and the next set of energy will not be better than what we had before. Cheap energy has made the population explosion possible. The blue curve there is population in billions of people, and the red curve is the amount of oil we produce every day. So the scale there goes from I can't use it good, from about 1900 here up to today. And you can see there's a pretty darn close correlation between the number of people on the world and the amount of oil we use. Why is that? It's because the use of oil made it possible for us to generate a tremendous amount of energy effectively for free and allowed us to get away from nature's rules. We can violate rules of nature now without much trouble. We can battle nature and win, whereas before we could not. And just in the last 150, 200 years, we've gone from using almost strictly human and animal power to not using them. Nowadays, human power, this muscle power, animal muscle power, machinery that is uses trees or wood for fuel. Now that amount of energy corresponds to less than 0.4% of the energy we use today. All the rest of it is fossil fuels. Or almost all of the rest of it is fossil fuels. This would be fine. It shouldn't be a problem as long as we find and develop fossil fuels at the same rate we use them. But unfortunately, that is not the case. The vertical axis there is gigabarrels per year. The bottom axis is time in years, 1930 up to 2050. To 2050. The blue are discoveries of oil. So you'll notice that there were many very large discoveries of oil, with the peak being before 1970. Some minor peaks in here, and there's actually a peak going on now, which is roughly 10 gigabarrels per year. But you'll notice that our use has gone up pretty much steadily, and as soon as the area under the red curve is equal to half of the area under the blue and yellow curve, we've used up half the resource. And we are very, very close to that now, if not past it. We now use, this point here, roughly 4 times the oil that we find every year. So there's just no question that the oil resource is depleting. We're using oil at a rate that is roughly 1 million times faster than the Earth can make oil. So we are using up a resource that's going to be gone relatively quickly. This shows the billions of barrels a year on the vertical axis, again in time on the bottom, 1930 to 2050. I was born in 1943, and at that time the world was using less than 10% of the oil that we use now. Less than 10%. Life was good back then, it's still good, but why are we using so much more? We're using a tremendous amount more. Of interest also on this plot is the yellow area here. This is oil production in the United States. And one of the most important things here is to notice that oil production peaked in the United States in 1970. We're now making less, about 1/4 or 1/3 of the oil that we were using from domestic oil is about 1/4 to 1/3 of what we were finding and using in 1970. This is the peak that M. King Hubbard was talking about when he said, we're going to start running out of oil starting in 1970 in the United States. And since that time, our oil use has gone up, but we've, of course, had to import it. We're up here. Actually, we're up here now. This is a little bit old slide. But the level has essentially leveled off since 2005. So this is production, roughly 75 billion barrels per year is what the world uses. And production has not climbed appreciably in the last 7 years. Is that a problem? Well, actually it is. This paper, this is again world spot price on this side, price of oil in dollars, US dollars per barrel, versus the crude oil production in millions of barrels per day. Before 2005, if the price of oil went up, production would increase. The production would go up with no trouble at all. This was pretty much a linear graph, and the price was pretty much well controlled by production or production by price, whatever you like. So this is like an elastic body. If you pull on the price, production follows and you produce more. But starting in 2005, production no longer increased, and price suddenly started to oscillate wildly. This is fact now. This is not a model. These are numbers straight off of the Energy Information Agency. This paper was published by Nature on Tuesday of this week. So in 2005, we went from an elastic demand production curve to an inelastic one. We can no longer get the amount of oil we need out of the ground to match the demand. This is a very serious problem. And the fact is we have used up about half the oil that can be reasonably pulled out of the ground. The low-hanging fruit is gone. Anybody who looks at oil production now realizes this, because where are we finding new oil? We're not finding it in Texas. We're not finding it in Oklahoma, where the big oil fields were before, or Saudi Arabia. Now we find it in places like deep water off the Gulf of Mexico. We find it in Alaska, north slope of Alaska. These places, we have to go literally now to the ends of the earth to find oil. And most of it has been discovered already. Almost pretty much 90% people think has already been discovered. And what we find is in smaller pockets, and it is also more expensive to drill and poorer quality than what we ever had before. This is one of the scariest slides I show, I think, anyway. This is time again on the bottom from 1600 to 2200, and billions of barrels remaining in the ground on this side, and roughly 2 billion barrels, or excuse me, 200 billion, 2,000 billion, so 2 trillion barrels available when we started. Then we started producing oil, and today we're down in here someplace. And if we keep producing at the same rate, then oil will essentially be gone by 2100. The gray area here is one human lifetime, roughly 90 years. So people alive today, kids born in 1990, say, will certainly see the end of oil. And since roughly 89-90% of the energy we use in Hawaii is dependent on oil, this has got to be a serious problem. In 1972, there was a paper, a little book published by what's called the Club of Rome. It's a group that was in MIT in the 1970s, and they did a study of what's going to happen as things run out. And they looked at things like population, industrial output, non-renewable resources, and pollution. So here's the curves here for these. The greenish curve here is what you need to do in order to kind of stabilize everything. And the other curve, that's the bluer one. The green curve is what would happen if we keep doing things the way we're doing them now. And this was back in 1970. Well, this whole study was criticized heavily because it happened right at the start of the Green Revolution, when suddenly we started producing more and more food, again thanks to oil, because of the fertilizers and transport abilities. But you'll notice that even though it was criticized heavily, if we look at the history since 1970, you look at the red dots here, we are tracking along extremely well with the curve for business as usual. And you'll notice the scariest part here is that it reaches a peak sometime within the next 15 or 20 years and starts to go the other way. So if their predictions are correct, we're in trouble. Well, how much energy do we actually use? We use, as human beings on the earth, we use roughly 1 cubic mile of oil every year. Doesn't sound like a terrible amount, but it's really huge. And we could replace that with 104 gas-fired plants, or 4 Three Gorges dams, or 52 nuclear power plants, or 91 million solar panels, or 32 million thousand wind turbines every year for 50 years. And then we would have replaced all the oil that we use now. Of course, that would leave no room for growth. So each of these numbers here is 1/50th of what we need to replace oil. That's a tremendous amount and very expensive. How much oil do we use in Hawaii? Well, people can give you all kinds of numbers, but this one happens to be the one I like best. If we had Aloha Stadium and we filled it with oil from the playing field to the top of the seats, we would need to do that 6 times every year. Fill it with oil 6 times every year from the playing field to the top seats in order to get the oil that we import every year in Hawaii. So that gives you some idea of just how huge an amount of oil that is. I didn't believe this number, so I checked it 3 times, and I did go from 7 to 6, but it is definitely 6. We use about 1 million barrels of oil every week in Hawaii. That's 42 million gallons of oil. This is a global problem. We cannot solve it in Hawaii, but we certainly can do things that would prevent the worst things from happening. Unfortunately, we depend pretty much entirely on tourism here. All our eggs are in one basket. And if planes stop flying, if boats stop coming to Hawaii, it's serious trouble. I'm sure you can imagine by yourselves just what would happen here. So we will feel these problems locally, but they are definitely global. So what's being done? The caption here says, and so while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of green companies, green groups, believe this. Most promoters of fossil or of non-fossil fuel solutions, a lot of them don't really see their product as a solution. They see it as a product that will give them a good profit. Every commercial energy alternative that I know about requires fossil fuels for its production, delivery, maintenance. This big tube here you see here is a Polaris wave energy generating device. They don't work very well, but it's made out of a lot of steel, and that steel is made with oil and natural gas. Alternatives are nearly all electric generators. They're electricity generators. Few people talk about the viable alternatives to transportation fuels, which certainly for Hawaii and for a lot of places uses up most of the oil. And in Hawaii, that's no different. About 65% of our oil, or 4 Aloha stadiums every year, is used for transportation. And I'm not talking about just cars and trucks. I'm talking about ships that bring all our supplies to Hawaii and airplanes that bring all our tourists to Hawaii. And without cheap transportation fuel, Hawaii is in deep trouble. You hear an awful lot about we could, we should, we can. The newspapers, we can do this, we can do this, we should build this. But just because some improvement of the state of the world is technologically feasible doesn't mean that it should or would be done. Many of these projects are not politically or economically realistic or responsible. And you all know what I'm talking about. When you think about things like rail, maybe, and how about this wind farms and things of this sort, they are all possible, but are they really economically realistic or politically feasible? Some are, but some are not. This is a quote from James Howard Kunstler, who is another one to look up if you like. Based on everything we know right now, no combination of renewable energy sources will even permit us to operate a substantial fraction of the systems we currently run. And everything from food production and manufacturing to electric power generation, we are in trouble. We will strive mightily to produce alternative energy sources to maintain the carrying capacity, but we will likely ultimately fail. This is due to the issues of scale, since no alternatives we know of or have come up with so far will come within an order of magnitude of the energy that's required. We might be able to use cooking oil from McDonald's to run a few cars, maybe even a few hundred cars. But that's all. Utility. Oil is such a wonderful fuel. It's such a wonderful chemical. It can be used for so many things, and unfortunately we've burned through half of it, and it won't be available for very long into the future. Not at any kind of a reasonable price. Issues of unintended consequences. We're certainly seeing unintended consequences of burning fossil fuels. And the other problem, of course, is human behavior. We just plain have a very difficult time trying to condition people or having people realize just what kind of trouble they are getting into. The true danger posed by our exploding population is not the absolute numbers, but it's how much we use, how much of this we are going through. It's becoming clear every day that global warming, water, soil and food depletion, biodiversity, loss and degradation of our oceans are worsening constantly, and that the situation is not sustainable. Bringing out a sustainable balance between ourselves and the planet will depend on us in very short order reducing the population, or our level of activity, or both. It's estimated that if the world was to use equal amounts of energy for every person on the planet, North American energy use would have to drop by 90%. I'm sorry?
You said that? What was that quite from?
That was from Paul Trefurka. I can give you a website if you like. One huge fear for me anyway is that our addiction to oil and our short-sighted desire to save the economy and push for growth, push for job growth, which I just plain don't think is possible over the long term, it'll drive depletion of these resources without mitigation. In other words, we'll talk about clean coal, but when you come right down to it, clean coal is going to be extremely expensive. And when we get down to it, people are going to say, we can't afford to do that, it's too expensive, and we'll burn the coal anyway. And then we really have troubles and approaching suicide. It really isn't hard to see why population control is this untouchable elephant in the room. The problem is the problem is just too big for any kind of a humane or even rational solution. We're stuck. And I hate to be so negative, but we're stuck. We are. Are there signs of hope? Yeah, there are. Some people will almost certainly make it through the problems that are coming up. There's groups like the transition movement, localization movements, intentional communities, even the preppers, which is now a TV show, I understand. People preparing for great changes in the way we live. And these are very important, although at this point very small groups that could really use the help from people who are knowledgeable in engineering and people who know what they're talking about. Unfortunately, a lot of them are populated by people who don't know what they're talking about. Bob Dylan, let us not talk falsely now, the hour is getting late. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people are talking falsely. People like Cheney knows exactly what peak oil is all about, and you don't hear anything from him. So does our current Department of Energy head. A lot of people know about this. A lot of people are very much aware, but they're not talking, and I think they should be. We're out of time, so thank you very much.
We've got 6 minutes for questions.
Okay, I have one.
Since human beings are part of nature, not apart from it, maybe the long-term effect is harder for the global population to drastically be reduced with the possibility of extinction, like other species. So what's wrong with that?
It's not a question of what's wrong with it. It's whether it will happen or not. And I agree with you. I think it will. Nature is going to win in the end. We can play with nature all we want, and in the end, it's going to. We are part of it, but unfortunately, oil has allowed us to get away from it. And when oil goes away, we'll be right back in it again. We both come to the same conclusion and we're in violent agreement with each other.
I've been reading a bunch of articles recently describing the United States as the Persian Gulf of natural gas, fracking, horizontal drilling, etc. United Arab Emirates has just given a purchase order to a South Korean consortium that's going to build 4 large nuclear power plants in the Emirates because they don't want to burn up the oil if they can sell it for $100 a barrel or whatever. And so could you comment on the possibility of LNG as a supply for Oahu? That LNG is, they're building LNG tankers all over the world, and the U.S. is apparently going to be in a position to export LNG. The one thing that will be the real problem is aviation jet fuel. But Oahu is probably the best place in the world for electric vehicles. So if Oahu could either go LNG or through the new Babcock and Wilcox 125 megawatt nuclear unit, those are the possibilities for Oahu. Could you bounce off some of that?
There are other people here. Hans, I'm sure, could address this just as well also. Also OTEC, right. There are alternatives, and the question is, is it possible to build up alternatives quickly enough? Do we have enough money to build them up? Do we have the backing of the government? Do we have the backing of investors to build them up quickly enough? And I think the answer to all of those is no. Hans would disagree, but things like a 100 megawatt plant is going to be about 7% of the electricity that we now use. If we start running cars on electricity, we're going to need 50% more.
Except you could charge them off peak.
You could charge them off peak, but you still need to put them, you need to get that energy from someplace. And you're right, but the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always blow. There are problems. OTEC is different in that it's always there. So is geothermal. And nuclear. Good luck with nuclear. We're talking about political feasibility.
If it's a matter of shut down or going nuke.
If by the time we approach that point, I'm afraid it'll be too late to build a nuclear plant. But I agree with you. You have your choice. You can build a nuclear plant or you can have the lights go off, and I think that's where we are.
Enjoying all the graphs, especially the dates. When do you expect the time will come when people will not run their air conditioners in the parking lot. When will that come? And what will the world be like then?
You mean car air conditioners?
Yes.
Yeah, I see it too. It just drives me crazy. I don't know if it'll ever come. I mean, people in the United States and North America are so spoiled. I don't really see them ever accepting even a 20% drop in the amount of energy they use. I may be wrong, but I think it's going to be extremely difficult to get them to change. They will have to change at some point. At some point, they'll say, I'm going to turn on my air conditioner, but the car won't start because they're out of gas. Okay, and then they will not turn on their air conditioner. When will this occur? Now you're asking me to predict the future, and that's where I run into trouble. But if you look at the models say we are going to start getting into real serious trouble within 10 to 20 years. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was quicker. If the Iranians block the Straits of Hormuz, good luck.
Fred, I'll predict the future. It's not our problem. We won't be here.
I'm retired. I don't. That's it.
Thank you. Your speech is entitled "The End of Cheap Everything," and in my opinion, I contend that oil was never a cheap alternative to energy because nobody considers the environmental costs. There's the risk involved in extracting it and transporting it. One of the things I'm amazed with all of these oil tankers crossing the ocean to get here to our island that we haven't had a mishap like we saw in Alaska and very recently in Italy. But can you, as a geologist, explain what is happening underground after this oil has been extracted? I mean, there's obviously some kind of a void and some sinkholes. That part I don't understand so well.
There are places like Long Beach that are sinking because of oil extraction, and parts of Texas are sinking because of oil extraction. But those problems are really, really minor compared to things like climate change and what it's actually doing to humans. I mean, we've become so dependent on this, we've been so addicted to this that when it's gone, everybody in the world is going to be affected by this.
The engineers and architects of Hawaii have lasted for over 100 years, one big reason being that we end promptly at 1 o'clock, and therefore it is 1. So, Doctor, if you could hold this plaque and pose for the nice camera. Not only are your words recorded for posterity, your photos for posterity, and your certificate of appreciation is for posterity. So thank you very much.
Thank you.